If you want a challenging reading list, then this one is a whopper. Recently, The Atlantic magazine published a list of the great American novels. They invited critics and scholars and writers to suggest novels that have been published in the last 100 years that they think qualify as the great American novel. And they did not constrict themselves or restrain themselves to any certain number, because this list is 136 novels long. I've had a quick look through, and it has that wonderful combination of some books that I have read, some that I've been wanting to read, some I've been slightly too intimidated to read or have been actively avoiding, and some books that I have never even heard of. So I want to have a proper look through and count up how many I've actually read. I'd be fascinated to know, how many of these books have you read? Please let me know about that in the comments below. I'm just going to briefly go through this list. Some I'll only mention by the title, because if I go into all of these books in detail, we will be here for hours and hours and hours. I think it will take quite a while anyway, so you might want to make yourself a hot drink to watch this video. I've made myself a giant cup of tea in my Golden Girls mug, a great American institution, and I'm also wearing my Smokey the Bear top, another great American institution. Only you can write the great American novel. And so I will discuss some of these books that I have read in more detail about them, or some fun facts or information about them. But I'd love to know if you love any of these books, if you agree with their choices, or if you have alternative suggestions for the great American novel that you would like to suggest, then let me know about that in the comments below as well. Now, what qualifies as the great American novel? They talk about this in the introduction a bit, as any kind of book that kind of embodies the American spirit. And a lot of these novels, I think, are, very particular. They're very subjective stories, but they speak about a lot of much bigger objective issues that we can all relate to, and that are something that is so integral to both the history and the ideology of America. At the end of the introduction, they say of these books that together they represent the best of what novels can do: challenge us, delight us, pull us in, and then release us a little smarter and a little more alive than we were before. You have to read them. And I have a slight issue with that last sentence, that anybody that says you have to read something, I always feel like there's this kind of judgment involved in that, like you're not a real reader if you haven't read all of these 136 books. And I have a slight bratish knee-jerk reaction to that, saying, like, I don't have to read this book to be a good reader. Although I made a video towards the end of last year, which I titled a rediscovered classic that you have to read. And I usually shy away from using titles like that. But then that video received a huge amount of views. So I don't know, I guess that's just modern life. We're all feeding the algorithm, aren't we? Now I'm going to go through each of these books, starting with the ultimate great American classic, first published in 1925, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, a novel about greed and money and self-made man and love, so, big American subjects. And I really need to reread this book, because I read it when I was a teenager or in my early 20s, and it just kind of like passed me by. I wasn't able to fully grasp it or appreciate it. So I would like to reread it now. I'm sure I'll get a lot more out of it now reading it as a proper adult. And also, I got this great manuscript version of The Great Gatsby, where it reproduces F. Scott Fitzgerald's actual handwriting, which you can see in here. And I just think it'll be so fascinating to read this novel and then like glance through different sections and see where he has like crossed out certain words or put in like new sentences, and to like see that actual writing process. That'll be a wonderful experience. An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser. This is one of those novels I've been slightly intimidated to read. It's around 800 pages long. It does involve a very dramatic story of a drowned girl and a man that's accused of that drowning. Maybe one day I'll read it. The Making of Americans by Gertrude Stein. Another great big book, 1,000 pages long. Can you call it a great American novel as if it isn't a giant tomb of a book? And another author I've been slightly intimidated of reading, that she has quite a strange elliptical style of writing, and to think of like a book that long, of reading it in that style. I'm not sure if I'm ever going to get around to this. Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. This is set in New Mexico. I would like to read this. I've read other books by Willa Cather and really enjoyed her writing. Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, based a lot on Hemingway's own experiences in World War I. Is about large-scale conflicts and doomed love affair. I would like to read this as well. I've read other books by Hemingway, but not this one. Passing by Nella Larson. This is such a beautiful novel. I read it for the first time a few years ago. Such a striking story about two Black women in America who are friends. One is very dark-skinned and one is quite light-skinned and can pass for white, and the conflicts that arise between them because of this, and what this says about racism and American identity. There was also a beautiful film of this made recently. The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. I've never read this particular Faulkner book, but the only experience I've had of reading Faulkner in the past, I read a couple of his novels early on in my life during one summer when I decided I was going to read all the great American classics. I didn't have to work, and I was at home from college, and so I was just like, I'm just gonna sit inside all day and read, and I was just reading and reading William Faulkner, and at the end of one day I found I'm so depressed. And like, why am I so depressed? It's like, maybe because I've just been sat inside all day reading this very depressing fiction. And so I should return to William Faulkner. I think another of these authors that now that I'm an adult, I'll probably appreciate him a lot more, but I'm not racing to read him. Another William Faulkner on the list, Absalom, Absalom. I've not read this one. I've read As I Lay Dying, but apparently Absalom at the time had the longest sentence that was ever in a novel. It was over 1,200 words long. Nightwood by Djuna Barnes. I'm so glad that this book is on this list. Even though it's about expats in Paris, it follows a very sad love triangle and a torrid love affair between three different women, and Djuna Barnes is such an oddball writer. I really connected with this story, even though it's a very strange tale. But I personally really connected with it. And I'd also written an essay about it to be included in this book, which was published a number of years ago, called 50 Gay and Lesbian Books Everybody Must Read, even though the original title that Richard Canning wanted to have for this book was 50 Gay and Lesbian Novels Everyone Should Read. But then the publisher changed it to must read, putting this imperative that you're not a good reader if you haven't read all of these books. East Goes West by Yunhil Khan, a novel about a Korean American, which I'd never heard of before, but this sounds fascinating. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, about a Black woman in America trying to find fulfillment in her life. And like a lot of college students, I absolutely loved reading this. The USA Trilogy by John Dos Passos. This has been sitting on my shelf for ages. A great big epic following turn-of-the-century America through World War I and the stock market crash. One day I'll get to it. Ask the Dust by John Fante. The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. This novel was so much fun to read. It's not the kind of fiction I usually go for. I'm following a detective sleuth, and the voice in it is so alive. It has a real rapid-fire energy and humor to it. The Day of the Locust by Nathaniel West. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I've not read this yet. I've read other books by Steinbeck, and his writing is incredible. So gripping, so powerful, and beautifully written. One day I'll get to this. I know I need to. Native Son by Richard Wright. Another one of these great American classics that I've been wanting to read and feel slightly guilty that I haven't read it yet. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. Another novel I need to get to. A Time to Be Born by Dawn Powell. All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. This book was such a pleasure to read and really interested me in politics and how corrupt politics can be. The Street by Anne Petrie, a novel about a black woman in Harlem in the 1940s, another book that I'd really like to read. In a Lonely Place by Dorothy B. Hughes. I've seen the film adaptation of this with Humphrey Bogart, but I've never read the novel. The Mountain Lion by Jean Stafford. This was recently republished. It's following siblings in Los Angeles. I've been wanting to read this because I've read Jean Stafford's short stories before, which are incredible. The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Like a lot of teenagers, I read this and was really involved in it, but it's one of those books I probably won't return to as an adult. I think I'll be slightly more critical of it now. Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. I loved reading this as a child, although whenever I think of this title now, I just think of that scene in The Simpsons when a substitute teacher that Lisa has a crush on is reading it aloud and starts crying in class. Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Such an incredible novel and a fictional demonstration of Black double consciousness. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Yep, an absolute classic. I loved reading it, and more relevant than ever with recent American censorship of books. Maud Martha by Gwendolyn Brooks, another novel that was recently republished that I really ought to read, following a black woman through this stream of consciousness style. The Adventures of Augie March by Saul Bellow. I remember really enjoying reading this novel about a Jewish boy and his hijinks in Chicago. Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Of course, a very uncomfortable read, but an excellent one. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, an absolute classic about two men's passionate love affair in Paris. An incredible book, and I was really happy to look inside to see this ticket I got for If Beale Street Could Talk when it was out in cinemas. Peyton Place by Grace Meta-Lewis. Deep Water by Patricia Highsmith. I've never actually read any Patricia Highsmith. I know, the shame. No Boy by John Okada. On the Road by Jack Kerouac. I read this as a young adult. I didn't think it was all that great. Yes, it captured the spirit of a movement, but it didn't really pull me in. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, another one of these great big American classics about war that I've never read. I know I should have read, and that it probably will draw me in because this is meant to be quite comical. I did see Joseph Heller talk when I first moved to London. He was giving a signing and reading in the basement of the Waterstones in Trafalgar Square, and it was incredible to see him speak. I was so struck at the time that there was barely anyone in the audience. A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Anglais. Another Country by James Baldwin, following a group of musicians and artists in New York City. It's so good. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, another novel that I've seen the film but not read the book. Pale Fire Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. I've not read this one by Nabokov. I tried to have this exercise for a while because I have quite a big group of his books. I wanted to read all of his books in the order that he wrote and published them. And I'd read the first few books and really enjoyed them, but then I got impatient. I skipped ahead to Lolita, and I just haven't gone back to reading any of his other books since then. The Zebra Striped Hearse by Ross MacDonald. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Yes, like a lot of young adults, I read this and loved it. The Group by Mary McCarthy, following a number of friends as they try to make their way in the world and their interactions with each other. And it's about the politics and the social circumstances of the time, but also about their very cutting relationships with each other. And it can get quite bitchy, making it such a pleasure to read. The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. This is the only Pynchon I've read because it's the short book that everyone has read. I don't remember a thing about it. A Sport and a Pastime by James Salter. Couples by John Updike. I've never actually read anything by Updike, I don't think. I feel like I should have done because he was a good friend to Joyce Carol Oates before he died. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. I, of course, have seen the film of Blade Runner, but I've not read the book, and I do feel really guilty about that. Divorcing by Susan Taubes. Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth. I remember reading this when I was a lot younger and enjoying it a lot. There was probably a lot of masturbation in it, wasn't there? Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, a novel that blends history and science fiction and dark humor. It's one of those books I feel like I really should have read when I was younger. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret by Judy Blume. I remember this being one of those books that I did want to read when I was younger, but felt like I shouldn't read, that it was more like a girl's book. I know that's really bad. I really enjoyed the recent film adaptation. Desperate Characters by Paula Fox. Played As It Lays by Joan Didion. I remember really enjoying this novel, despite its like bleakness and this character with her spiritual emptiness in Las Vegas. Definitely embodies something about America. Log of the SS, the Mrs. Unguentine by Stanley Crawford. I'd never heard of this book. It's a slim novel about a couple adrift at sea. Mumbo Jumbo by Ishmael Reed. Sula by Toni Morrison. I've read a number of Toni Morrison's books, but not this one. The Revolt of the Cockroach People by Oscar Zeta Acosta, about a Chicano civil rights movement in Los Angeles in the 1970s. Never heard of this, but sounds fascinating. Oreo by Fran Ross, one of these kind of cult novels that I would really like to read. The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. I read my first novel by Le Guin last year, and I do want to read more. Winter in the Blood by James Welch. Corregidora by Gail Jones. I read this for the first time when it was republished here in the UK a few years ago. I thought it's an incredible story of a black singer and the conflict she has in her life. And it's amazing that Gail Jones has been publishing a lot more books recently after many, many years of just silence from her. Speedboat by Renata Adler. Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. Such a mesmerizing read, and yes, a great American classic. A Contract with God by Will Eisner. Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran. A great gay American classic that I feel guilty I've not read yet. The Stand by Stephen King. I've not read this book. There was a 90s miniseries version of this story which I so enjoyed watching, but it's not available in any video format. Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. I know, a great sci-fi classic that I should have read, and I got this recent edition of it that comes with a foreword by Ayobami Adebayo. So yes, I will read this at some point. The Dog of the South by Charles Portis. Housekeeping by Marilyn Robinson. The story of two sisters and their coming of age. It is so beautiful, so stunning, so profound. I love this book. The Salt Eaters by Tony Codd Bambara. Little Big, or The Fairies' Parliament by John Crowley. Oxherding Tale by Charles Johnson. Machine Dreams by Jane Ann Phillips. Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. I meant to go on a McCarthy reading binge when he died recently, but I didn't start it. A Summons to Memphis by Peter Taylor. Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. I've not read the book, but I loved the miniseries. Beloved by Toni Morrison. Absolute stunning classic and such a heartbreaking book. Dawn by Octavia E. Butler. Geek Love by Catherine Dunn. Tripmaster Monkey by Maxine Hahn Kingston. I've not read this book, but I have read The Woman Warrior, which is excellent. Dog Eaters by Jessica Hagedorn. American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. Oh, Bret. I was completely gripped by this book. How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents by Julia Alvarez. Mating by Norman Rush. Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison. I have always meant to read this. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Now, I came to this book quite late. I did really enjoy reading it, but I didn't quite love it. Like so many of my friends call it their favorite book of all time, so I was expecting to be head over heels about it. It is great. Donna Tartt's writing is so gripping, but yeah, I just didn't completely fall for it. So Far From God by Anna Castillo. Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. The Shipping News by Annie Proulx, a novel that should be quite melancholy to read given its subject matter, but it's also such a pleasure. Native Speaker by Chain Ray Lee. Sabbath's Theater by Philip Roth. Under the Feet of Jesus by Helena Maria Viramontes. Infinite Jest by David Forster Wallace. Nope. I don't think I'm ever gonna get to reading this. I know that means I'll never be a lit bro. I Love Dick by Chris Cross. I've not read this book. I remember it had a kind of cult resurgence a number of years ago. I should get to it, given the title, shouldn't I? Underworld by Don DeLillo. Is there anything more American than the great sport of baseball? Why not have a giant novel about it? The Intuitionist by Colson Whitehead. His first novel. I've not read this. I love the Underground Railroad in his other books, so I should get to it. Blonde by Joyce Carol Oates. Her fictional reimagining of the life of Norma Jean Baker. This is a novel that's very personal to me. I wrote my MA dissertation partly on it about this kind of Dickensian story of a girl who radically reinvents herself and then becomes trapped in her own illusion of this character she's created. And I know there is lots of controversy about the recent film and debates about it, but yeah, such an amazing story. What she does in this narrative and how she follows her consciousness is just incredible. And Joyce Carol Oates sent me a copy of this book after I'd written my MA dissertation and sent it to her. And she was very complimentary and nice about it. And I just love it. House of Leaves by Mark Z. Daniel Whiskey. I've always been curious about this book, but I've never read it. The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. The Last Samurai by Helen DeWitt, a novel that I know so many people have loved. I really want to read. The Quick and the Dead by Joy Williams. Erasure by Percival Everett. It's been so great to see Everett's career really taking off in the past couple of years, and I've not read this book, but I did love the recent film of American Fiction collection. I, the Divine by Robbie Alamedine. I've not read this book. I did read another book by him, which I thought was excellent. The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen, a great novel of family. Yes, it is such a pleasure to read and so fascinating. Although I do feel like Franzen has been like slightly too self-conscious about trying to write the great American novel, and I'm always slightly wary of writers like that, and never quite forgiven Franzen for his kind of snobbish attitude when he was first put on the Oprah's book club list, and his reaction to that is he probably, wants to be read by academics, rather than largely women's book club. But of course, Oprah got over that because she also put his novel Freedom on her book club list. Caramello by Sandra Cisneros. Perma Red by Deborah Magpie Erling. The Russian Debutante's Handbook by Gary Shatainagart. The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. Such a great novel, and America really lost something when Lahiri moved to Italy, although I don't blame her. Veronica by Mary Gateskill. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Juno Diaz. This has been on my shelf for ages, but I've not read it yet. A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. I Hotel by Karen Te Yamashita. Open City by Teju Cole. Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. I've not read this, but I read another book by her. Her style of writing is just stunning. The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. I've not read this, although I bought a copy of it in the Strand bookstore in New York City many years ago. It's just been sitting on my shelf. I've read a number of other books by Erdrich, and I've always enjoyed her novels, but I've never fully loved them, although I love everything that she's about, and that Erdrich has a bookstore of her own. Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Such a brilliant, epic, and love story, and incredible book. Nevada by Imogen Binney, a novel that I read fairly recently and absolutely loved, although it was kind of missold. I'd heard that it was a road trip novel, which it is partly, but that only takes up a small portion of the book. It's mainly set in New York City, following a trans woman, and how it conveys her experience so honestly and so powerfully. I thought it was so gripping and very raw and real. A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James. A really great epic. So many fascinating characters, really gripping story that's really complex and builds to show so many different layers over time. And also it's fascinating. You don't really know about the true story of the title of this novel until you get towards the very end of the book. Family Life by Akhil Sharma. Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. I know not everybody loved this book about a relationship told in a very clever way, but I was completely gripped by it. The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. The Sellout by Paul Beatty, about a man who goes to the Supreme Court about a race trial. I thought this book was okay. I just didn't really get that into it. I think it's partly about expectations, because I was told this was a very funny novel and I didn't find it all that funny. The Sympathizer by Viet Tan Nguyen. Amiable with Big Teeth by Claude McKay. Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. This novel is so inventive and emotional, and I was completely gripped by it, how it mixes history with fiction to tell this wild story of all these spirits in a graveyard and Lincoln's grief over his son. It's just absolutely incredible, and I love this beautiful cover. And when I had George Saunders sign it for me, he did this funny thing where he created a peace symbol hanging off from his signature, and he pointed it out and is like, I don't know why I just wrote that. Sabrina by Nick Dern Parnaso, a graphic novel I'm so happy is on this list because it does feel like it really embodies something about the American spirit, about missing Sabrina, and it's about the process of grief, but also about gun control and some characters that just feel this like gaping emptiness in their lives. Severance by Lin Ma. There by Tommy Orange. I've not read this novel, but I really want to. He just came out with a sequel of it recently, didn't he? Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli. This is definitely a road trip novel that's so mesmerizing and really inventively told, but also beautiful and so emotional. I loved this book. Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. The Old Drift by Namwali Serpell. No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. I remember when this came out, it felt like everybody was talking about this because it was nominated for a number of prizes, and I didn't entirely get on with this book. I just, especially like as it went along, although I know a lot of people found the later part of this book incredibly emotional, but when I heard Patricia Lockwood giving a reading from it, like the real emotions of the book and the power of it came out. So I probably should reread it at some point and reevaluate it. The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honorary Fanon Jeffers. And yes, it is pronounced Du Bois. That is how W.E.B. Du Bois pronounced his own name. And this is an incredible epic about family and history and racism and so many things. Absolutely absorbing. I completely loved it. And finally, Biography of X by Catherine Lacey. I'm so glad to see this on this list. A novel that just came out last year, was one of my favorite books of the entire year that I'd read, and such a gripping story that's so fascinatingly told, following a woman who's writing a biography about her recently deceased wife, who was a very complex and mysterious artist, and interviewing a number of people that were connected to her, but also tracing this alternative history of America in such a brilliant way. And I love this story so much. And yes, a really great American tale. So those are all the books on this list of great American novels. Yes, I could and probably should have talked about some of these books more, but if you want to point them out to me and encourage me to read them in the comments below of the ones I haven't got to. So in total, I have read 44 out of these 136 books. I feel slightly ashamed about that, but no, I'm not ashamed because I've read many, many other really great books, and I don't think any of us should feel ashamed about our numbers. But if you want to let me know in the comments below, how many have you read? I'd love to hear about that and any of your recommendations, or especially your recommendations of alternative great American novels that you think do belong on this list. So yes, I want to suggest some of my alternative choices as well. There's In America by Susan Sontag, which is such an incredible story about personal reinvention of a Polish actress that moves to America to found a commune, and following the consequences of that, but also shifts in her own sense of self over time. It's a great, incredible story. Also, a recent addition I would add is Northwoods by Daniel Mason, a very American story following one property over a long period of time, and all of the changes to this New England house over time, and the people who move through it and following their stories. Also, yes, I would put Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellmann on this list. A great giant novel following a woman and all of the thoughts crowding her mind and going through her head, and how it brings all of this together, I think, is just absolutely ingenious. A very American story, even though I think Lucy Ellman lives in Scotland permanently, but this story of a woman in America and all of the anxiety in her life and the pressure she feels, just how it brings all that together in such a brilliant way. I found it absolutely mesmerizing and funny and terrifying and so good. And when the plot really kicks in towards the end of the story, it's so, so good. So those are some of my alternative choices and additions to these great list of great American novels. And but yeah, let me know about yours in the comments below and what you think about any of these books. Hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.